And now I'm honored to be joined by civil rights leader and humanitarian Martin Luther King III, the oldest son of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Following in his father's footsteps, his efforts to rid the world of social, political, and economic injustice have made Martin Luther King III one of the most respected civil rights activists in the nation today. It's so great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just ask you, the last time we spoke, we were reflecting on how COVID was hitting different communities in this country. We were in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and other murders in this nation. And we also talked about the economic hits that yet again showed how exacerbated and how wide the gaps were in this country. And one of those biggest gaps is race. You've been at this longer than most folks I know. Are you optimistic at all that we're moving in the right direction? And what would be some of the things we've got to get in place to make more progress?
So, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic, by the way, even in times where it's very difficult. And I would say the last certainly 4 years have been difficult. But actually, if you talk to many persons in different communities, it has not just been the last four. The difficulty has existed for quite a long time. It certainly came to a tremendous head, I think, in the last 4 years. But beyond that, though, I stay optimistic because I have to believe in the humanity of human beings. I believe that there's far more good in people than there is bad. And I think we have to find ways to create the climate to bring out the best of who we are. Oftentimes, as it relates to race, some of it may be unconscious bias. In fact, maybe the majority of it is. And when you teach and train people, and I think what I mean by that is in schools, we need a curriculum that, in my judgments, has, and this, by the way, should start in kindergarten or pre-K, all the way through college, so that you have diversity, human relations, sensitivity, and other types of training and exposure that help you to understand different cultures. Because I think when we understand that every culture is different, everyone has made a contribution, and you're inspired by that training for all those years, we create a different kind of environment for everybody.
Let me ask you, I've talked to a number of other key black leaders, Reverend William J. Barber, Cornel West, others that have said with the Biden administration in play now, that one of the things they worry about is we've got folks that talk the talk but don't walk the walk, that there's always the risk that the communities that have been marginalized can continue to be marginalized even with their supposed allies in power. I guess what would be your expectations right now of the Biden administration on race and justice?
So I know the president has talked about putting a commission in place to look at the issue of policing. Now, historically, and from time to time, commissions have been great, and I do think it's needed. But a commission with real teeth to make recommendations that are going to be implemented, quite frankly, because it's not just in policing. It really is through, corporate America. Corporate America has to make some major steps around diversity, inclusion. Everyone now has a D&I department. But are you really funding it? Are you focused on it? Leadership has to come from the top. So the CEO, along with the board, must reflect diversity, along with the C-suite, along with all throughout the organization. If we are meant to make these kind of steps, I think people will begin to feel that progress is being made. And then we've got to find ways to address the healthcare crisis. The fact of the matter is Black and brown communities are often the essential workers, but they also have the worst levels of healthcare. We've got to find a way to ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So I certainly can agree with some who've said, whether it's probably, certainly Dr. Cornel West, maybe Dr. Barber as well, we can't sit on our laurels. We have to continue to challenge and hold elected officials accountable. It's not going to happen automatically, but if people are constantly raising these issues and rising up in a unified way, I think we will make good progress.
Do you feel as if in the appointments that you've seen, of course we have, Kamala Harris as vice president, and you mentioned to me last time we spoke that you saw that as a very positive trend, that many young people of color could see that and feel inspired by it. But are you positive about the appointments and, I should say, the diversity of appointments in the Biden team?
I certainly feel optimistic about the appointments, and I think if all of them are confirmed, it is certainly a diverse cabinet, maybe even more diverse than President Obama had to some degree. So I'm excited about that. But it's, again, how do you get the whole government to reflect that? And how do you get policies and principles? I mean, there's so much that has to be repositioned. A lot of it, the president has started by doing executive orders, but there's got to be legislation because legislation is far more difficult to change. An executive order, a new president can come in and change it. I'm glad we're back in the climate accord. The climate accord is one. I think there's some things around race that have executive orderly been done, but we need legislation. There's the George Floyd Policing Act that was passed in the House, but has not been heard in the Senate. There was the John Lewis Voter Registration Restoration Act, which was passed in the House, but not in the Senate. There's legislation around responsible gun legislation that was passed in the House, but not in the Senate. But with the majority, the hope is that these issues can, in a relatively quick manner, be passed.
I want to ask you a kind of interesting question about what your North Star is. I'm very familiar with the work and contributions you've been making, but, and really living out and continuing to speak to and act on the legacy of your father. And I guess, the interesting question I have is, when do you know when the right time is to negotiate pragmatically in the center to move things forward? And when is it time to take the stand and engage in nonviolent protest and civil actions? Because it seems like to me that you're able to do both of those. And for a lot of people watching and are concerned about race and justice and moving the needle forward, I think it'd be interesting for them to hear what your North Star is and how you decide when those moments are.
So when we talk about what is pragmatic and what, I don't really like labels, but we always we talk about conservative and we talk about liberal or progressive. And I err often, more times than not, on the progressive side. Give one example. Here's an example. Some in Congress talked about the fact that those who were talking about defunding the police, because defunding the police is an issue that many people are concerned about, that Democrats lost. Well, the reality is the Democrats that actually won were the progressive Democrats in New York and in Missouri, and I think there's one more seat. But yet Democrats who purported to be right in the middle have lost, and the Democrats lost some, to still maintain the majority in the House I'm talking about. So I think my North Star is, when you're doing the right thing, whatever it is that benefits the most people, if it happens to be progressive, so be it. I think we have to take those risks. The time is always right to do that which is right. Or what you really believe is right for the nation. Oftentimes we take positions that are safe. My father used to say the ultimate measure of a human being is not taking positions that are safe, nor expedient, or nor political, but we must take those positions because our consciences tell us they're right. So whenever we do right, if it happens to be progressive, I think that's the time. In some cases, there may be positions that we take that are conservative. Example does not come to mind right this moment, but I think that you always have to hold out for progress. We should be in an era of expansiveness, not exclusion and retracting. And I think the last 4 years we sort of retract in one sense. I think we as a nation have to constantly be in expansion. So people may say, well, you're a liberal or progressive. Well, I don't really, it's not an issue for me what one may think I am. What I believe I am is I want to do what is right and good and just for all in society. And I'm going to continue to forge forward. As I said, inclusion. It's not exclusion. We've excluded people. We've mistreated the indigenous population that's been here. Some may call it Native Americans. Some may call it Indians or call them Indians. But the fact of the matter is we had to go back, in my judgment, and recast ourselves so that we treat everyone correct. And we really do need to deal with these areas where we've made grave mistakes. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's reparations. Now, some people would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, from my point of view, it does. Reparations have been given for many, or some ethnic groups over the years.
Right.
And I think that's a discussion we need to have. And I believe it's actually being discussed in Congress. It was just a few days ago.
Martin, let me just squeeze in one last question here. My folks are going to get upset, but I want to. But I love talking to you about this because you talk about the full picture and you really talk, across all communities. But you also talk a lot about corporate America. We often talk about income inequality and fixing the minimum wage at $15. We're not talking about corporate boardrooms. We're not talking about inclusion at big companies. Do we need to broaden our aperture that when we look at this question of income inequality, and look at it more broadly, because I think you do that. I'd love to get your map, your strategic dashboard of how you address poverty and what the real pathway is forward. Is it really just talking about a $15 minimum wage, or do we need to move way beyond that?
The $15 minimum wage is just one aspect, but it's a significant aspect. There's obviously, rejection on that because small businesses, many of them don't feel they're able to accommodate that level. But the fact of the matter is, we've given subsidy to major corporations for years. It's really interesting. We don't have a problem providing and subsidizing all these huge corporations, but we're not able to help the small businesses, certainly to come up to the $15 level. I think it's interesting. For example, I don't like to be critical of anyone, but in West Virginia, Senator Joe Manchin has a number of people in his community that need to be risen to that level, and yet he's against the $15. But he's for maybe 11 or 12. So he's moving in the right direction. But the fact is, many of these poor communities, Mitch McConnell, Kentucky, one of the poorest states in the country, and the Kentuckians need that. And yet it's interesting that the Republican position is, well, that's way too much. Well, I just believe you have a different standard when it comes to subsidizing, as I said, the large corporations. Why can't we help the small business people? And then we can move the pendulum up. $15 is the first step. It's not the only step. I think there are other things. When you talk about corporate America, it's such a huge area of where there needs to be movement. I talked about earlier corporate boards being diverse. And right. I think D&I departments are enhanced. They're being, those departments are being increased. When we look at the C-suites, we need blacks and women, and we need Latinos and Hispanics, and maybe even some other ethnic groups, not in positions of human relations. That's good, but we need marketing. We need all those positions that will move those individuals to the CEOs. When we're able to do that, I think we have a much better corporate structure. We have a much better nation that feels diverse and engaging, and no one is excluded.
Well, human rights advocate Martin Luther King III, I always enjoy our conversations. Thanks for stretching our minds today. Really great to see you.
Thank you, and same here.